Greetings all, I'm Colyer, I'm a Support Operations Manager here at GitLab, and today we're going to go over how the one-on-one issue generator works. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. So this is the repo where the one-on-one issue generator lives. Now, the way this works is through using GitLab CI/CD to run various jobs, and these run scripts within it. The stages for this are test, gather, report, and create. There is the cache path of vendor Ruby to help kind of speed up some of the gem installation. Every script will run before it actually runs the script that it's said to run. It will run ruby-v to confirm the version and then bundle install to install all the gems. Now, the test stage consists of one job. It's the test files job. It doesn't run on schedules, but this runs the test script every time. This is useful because it makes various tests. We'll go over that in a bit, but it prevents us from putting bad files into the repo. This helps ensure that everything runs smoothly when it comes to the actual CI/CD schedules. There's the gather stage. Now this runs the gather data job. This only works on schedules. It requires the variable stage equals gather, or rather this variable stage has to equal gather for this to actually proceed. The script it runs is the gather script. We'll go over that in a bit. This creates an artifact in the data folder and it expires in 4 hours. Now the report stage runs the daily report script. It requires the gather data job to have succeeded. It only runs on schedules. It requires that the stage variable is equal to gather, and it runs the daily report script. Then we get to the 3 create jobs. These run based on the variables that are set. There's the weekly report. What this does is run via schedules when the stage is equal to weekly, and it runs the weekly report script. The monthly report job, kind of the same deal. It requires that the stage is equal to monthly and the agent name variable has been set. It doesn't check for what it's set for, just that it exists, it has value. It runs the monthly report script. And then there's the quarterly report script. It's pretty similar to the monthly report script. The stage has to be quarterly in this one, and it has to have the agent name variable, and it runs the quarterly report script. Now going over these scripts, let's look through these real quick. We'll start with test because that's the one that has more data to it. But essentially what this does is it requires the generator files in the lib folder, and it's going to go through and use Ruby to search every YAML file and ensure that it is readable, that it can be parsed. It's going to look for all the announcement files, and once again, just make sure that they're parsed, make sure they have data, make sure that they have the announcements array. The comments files, it's going to go through those, and it's going to make sure they're parsable. It's going to make sure that they have the ticket review boolean. It's going to make sure they have the comments array. And then it's going to go through all the ERB template files, and it's just going to confirm, hey, I can render this, and it works all right. If there's no errors, it'll succeed, but if there's any errors at any point, it's going to abort the function. It's going to fail the CI/CD job, which is what we want. We don't want to proceed with anything else if there's broken files in place. Now, beyond that, you have the, we'll go with the daily, let's go with the gather script to start with, because it just runs generator client gather. We'll go over the actual lib folders in a bit, but the rest of these kind of do the same thing. Like if we go to the daily report, all it's doing is generator GitLab daily report, commit daily reports. If we go to like the quarterly report, all it's doing is running generator GitLab quarterly report run. Monthly report's going to run, get generator GitLab monthly report run. And, we have the weekly report, which is going to run generator GitLab weekly issue create. So going into these, we start with the generator RB file. This is kind of the main file that defines the module. All it's doing is setting the module generator, requiring the bundler setup, requiring OpenURI, making sure bundler requires everything that it requires, and then it's requiring the generator client script. So if we go into the generator folder, we can look at the client script. Here, it's going to call the module generator and create a class called client. It's going to require the GitLab PagerDuty and Zendesk files. Beyond that, there's the gather function, which is the important one. That's where it gets the data, it puts it to the user's value, and then it's going to also use the the Zendesk Global run, Zendesk US Federal run, PagerDuty scheduled, and the GitLab gather run functions to generate all this data, and then it's going to artifact it. Now, I put some retry options in here. This basically makes it so that if it hits a timeout or hits a you need to wait kind of error, it actually tells Faraday, yeah, go ahead and do that. Let's retry, but you can look into Faraday options to kind of learn more about this. The artifact function just takes the data. It's going to set a variable called date, where it's basically just getting the date today in UTC minus 1 day. So it's basically saying, give me yesterday's date. From there, it's going to open a file in the data folder with the date underscore analysis.json. And all that's going to have in it is the data that we've gathered, but in JSON format. Now we set some clients like the ZD client, the US Fed client. All this is doing is calling the Zendesk API client, passing some values to the configuration. The PagerDuty client doing kind of the same thing, but this time we're using pure Faraday for this. We're making a new Faraday connection to the api.pagerduty.com URL, making sure the retry is set with those retry options, making sure authorization is the token that we need, that the headers are told to accept the vnd.pagerduty plus JSON. That's something PagerDuty themselves says to do. And we're making sure the adapter in this case is net HTTP. Normally I would go with the default adapter, but PagerDuty was pretty specific that that's what you need to use for this. We also set up a GitLab client. Once again, it's a new Faraday connection using a specific URL with the retry options. The URL is encoded. It tells the adapters the Faraday default adapter, and the headers, it sets the private token to the GitLab token. Beyond that, we have a function for the support team YAML. This is basically going to take the URL for the raw support team YAML file, send that request to Git through the GitLab client using the public send Git function, and it's going to get it back and save this as YAML.safeload, which means it's going to safe load it. I passed in the date, so it knows that some of these values in that file are dates, not just strings. Daily report's kind of the same deal. It's passing to the daily report repo, but it's going to use a specific date to figure out what file to grab. It's going to make the GitLab client. It's going to do a public send, and it's going to parse that file in JSON because the artifacts that this all generates that we might have to gather later are JSON files. Now there's the agent agenda file function. What this does is basically look at the agent and grab their project ID for the one-on-one generator. It's going to set that URL there and look for the repository files in that project. And if there's nothing, it's just going to return saying, yeah, there is none, false. If it does get something, it's going to JSON parse that. If it has a message to the JSON body, which would mean that instead of the actual file we were looking for, what we got was a JSON object from GitLab that said no such file or whatever. It's going to instead return false. But if all of that works, it is a valid file, it has content, it's going to give us the content of the file. We have the users function, which just says prepare users. And all this does is use the support team YAML file, the support team YAML content we got before, and set up some basic objects for the various data we're going to gather. It varies based on what we're doing, like Zendesk has assigned public comment, private comment, SSAT, and CCs. The default object is current and previous. That's something we use for the GitLab, because you can see in GitLab we have pairings default, internal default, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then PagerDuty's object is just this week, next week. That's all the client file, the client class actually does. But let's go through some of these other files. I'll pull the GitLab one first, and we'll go through that. All this does is it's making a new module called GitLab and requiring all the GitLab files. And if we go into the GitLab folder, we've got a bunch of files here. So let's start with gather. We call the module generator, we call the module GitLab, and then we're making a new class called gather. For the client, instead of just calling out the long string of generator client, geo client every time, we're just going to go ahead and set the global client variable to mean that. If you're not familiar, this right here where it's 2 pipes and an equal sign is a Ruby kind of shortcut for saying, if client has no value, it hasn't been set it to this. If it does have value, don't worry about it. So we have the run function, which essentially is going to output that it's gathering from GitLab. It's going to use the data from the agents, and it's going to loop through on every agent, say that it's gathering for that agent's name, and it's going to look through all these various objects. Now I'll go over like one of them because they all pretty much are the same, just different URLs. We have some functions just to give us some, the week start, the weekend, last week's start, last week's end, last month, yeah. They're just a bunch of date calls. That way it's easier to call this. We have ones for quarters, which are a little more specific, but next we define the request, which is going to use that client, that GitLab client, to make a public send function. It's going to use HTTP method, the endpoint, and the params, and then use OJ to load it for us so it's nice and easy to work with. Agents are set to whatever the generator client users are. It's just an easier way to call it. We set some functions here to say this is what an issue object looks like. This is what a merge request object looks like. For a determine wait function, it's basically going to look at the merge request and look at the wait and see, or look at the labels and see if it can find the wait label. If it doesn't find one, it's just going to say 0. It has no wait. If it does, it's going to actually split to give us what the actual wait is. Now, here we have some options that we're going to pass in, because if you remember correctly in the request, we can, method, endpoint, params. We are actually going to use some of this in the URL, so the endpoint. But like for closed issues, we want the status closed, the assignee is whoever we're working with, per page, give us 100, order by, updated at, sort by, descending. Merge request, we want scope all, state merge per page 100, author ID is whoever we're working with. And open options are going to be scope all, state opened per page 100, author ID is whoever we're working with. So I'll go through pairings, but the rest of the calls, the internal, the merge, the documentation, they're all going to be the same, just with different request URLs. But it's going to print out what it's doing. So gathering pairings, it's going to set its options to the closed issue ops, since pairings are closed issues. It's going to get the results from a request, a GET request to the project that is holding the pairings, and it's going to be looking for issues with the ops. It's going to loop through each of those. If the closed at is nil, it's going to assume if there's something wrong with it, it hasn't been closed properly, and it's going to skip it. The closed at, it's going to use a date parse to parse the closed at. That's because what we get from GitLab is a string, but we need to make sure that we have it in date format for comparison with our other date objects. If the closed at is before last week's start, since pairings are for, we report on those weekly, it's just going to skip the iteration because we don't need to report on it. It's going to print out a dot for each one that it actually reviews at this point, just so we can quickly look and see where it's at. But basically from there, if the closed at is greater than or equal to last week's start and it's before last week's end, it's going to say, okay, cool, put it in the previous week's, objects, the array for that. If it's, after this week's start, but before this week's end, go ahead and put it in the current. You can see, like with internal, it's the exact same general gist of things. There's some little nuances to it, such as this one only looks for success or failed because of internal issues. Interviews are pretty much the exact same. Modules are the exact same. Open issues are even simpler because it's just looking for open issues. Most of these are pretty much the exact same. We haven't analyzed merge functions so that it can kind of go through merge requests to figure out, okay, is it documentation, front end, back end, design, support, fix, or other? But that's really all there is to the actual gathering of the data for GitLab itself. So we can go back to GitLab and let's look at daily report. This is a simpler one. It's just making a daily report class. Once again, we're calling the client as the GitLab client. We're setting that request function again. And then we're basically just going to take that daily report and we're going to commit it. That's all there really is to it. It's essentially committing it to a project. That way we have the artifacts, we can save them, we can call them readily. This is actually an optimization we made since V1. V1 just gathered them daily and reported on it that way, or tried to gather them over the course of a week. We found that often caused a lot of problems, especially since the search we were using for Zendesk had a limit to the number of returns. Wasn't great. This was actually a fix where it's like, right, if we just commit each day's thing, it's a lot easier to run because we can, if we need to, break searches down by the hour, by the 30-minute mark, by the 5-minute mark. Before we were really limited, so this was a good fix. Beyond that, there's like the weekly issue. The way this works is it sets the class weekly issue. Once again, we're setting that GitLab client, the request function. Good optimization was I should probably have another file that has these common things in there, such as the client and the request, and have these files inherit from that. So that's a future optimization we can do. Data, it's going to do this by getting the analyze reports function output. For the title, this is literally just a function to say what the issue's title will be. A week of reports, it's a function that is setting this week of reports to fetch reports, which is literally going to take today and then go, 1 week ago to today, and it's going to map that to a string and basically get every one of those report files that the gather script or the commit script had made, and it's going to read those, and it's going to push those to the reports array, which then the array is what will output. What will return. So week of reports is basically just literally a week's worth of reports of the analysis files of the results files. One important thing we do, you can see how we have analyze reports. So analyze reports takes that week of reports that we got up here. It takes the very last one, because that's going to be the one with the most accurate support team YAML data. And what it's going to basically do is say, well, okay, agent Zendesk is actually equal to combine the reports, because we need to combine all these various Zendesk data, because we have 7 days worth of Zendesk data that we need to combine. And then it's basically just going to give us the last report. Now, the way this works when you combine them is it's going to make a loop on the main and the US federal instance, because it's 2 different Zendesk objects. From there, it's going to make an array make a loop on assigned public comments, private comments, SCCs, the various categories for Zendesk objects. And it's essentially going to set the instance, it's going to set that type, and it's going to empty out the array. This is pretty useful just for the sake of what we're doing is emptying it out so that we can then go through every report, add to it, but also do a bunch of checks with it. So we're going to set an end time and a start time. Then we're going to go over the weekly reports. We're going to set it to an array, go over it. If it can't determine who owns the actual item in the week of reports, it's actually going to skip it, because it's like, I don't know who this is. No point continuing. From there, it'll go through that, that week of reports items, that reports items for the main and US federal Zendesk instance, go over each of these. And it's essentially just going to parse them to make sure that the updated date is greater than or equal to the start time. The updated date is less than or equal to the end time, basically making sure it's in that criteria of time that we want. And it's going to push that to tickets. And at the end, it's going to concat all of those together to give us one Zendesk object that contains a week worth of Zendesk objects. So beyond that, we kind of get to where we're actually going to do something with all this data. Because right now we've mostly just parsed it, gone through it, and all that fun stuff. So the user template, this is a nice function basically to tell us what template to use for the user. Namely, it looks and says, okay, well, if they have their own customized file, use that. But if not, we're going to go with the default weekly report.erb file. Run today is a function that's just going to figure out what today's weekday number. Weekday number is 0 being Sunday, 6 being Saturday. And it's going to look at the agent's one-on-one generator settings for day of the week and say, yeah, only run if they want it run today. In this way, we can make it so if you want your report run on Sunday, cool, we can have your issue generated on Sunday. If you want it on Thursday, we can generate on Thursday. It basically lets you kind of customize it. So it'll only return true if today's weekday is the day that you set it to. Otherwise, it's going to say false. Now, the create function, what this is going to do is go through the data for each agent. And if the agent's one-on-one generator section is completely empty, it's just going to skip the iteration because they obviously don't want one made. If the agent's one-on-one generator's project ID is empty, it's also going to skip the iteration because if we don't have a project, we can't make an issue. And unless run today returns true, which means they want it run today, it's also going to skip the iteration. Now, beyond that, it's going to output that it's creating the issue for the agent. It's going to make an ERB renderer object, which is going to be erb.new, and it's going to read the user's template file. we have the issue ops here where we have the title is, the title function. The description, which is the big body of the issue, is going to be the ERB's renderer, the result with the hash. Users, the agent, and data. Users is the data that we have entirely. We're going to make sure to set it confidential to true. We're going to make sure to add any labels that the agent set in their one-on-one generator section. And we're going to make sure that the agent is assigned to their issue because we want to make sure that they know it's their issue. So we're going to run the create issue function using the agent and the issue ops that we set up here to get in. This should return an IID, an issue ID. And from there, we'll run the comment on issues using the agent and the IID. So comment on issues pretty much is going to set an empty array as the comments variable. And then it's going to basically go through the comments file, announcement file, agenda file. And then it's going to go through all of these and create comments on the issue for it. So the comment file, basically it's going to say the ticket review. It's going to have the ticket review function. It's going to have the from comment file function. It's going to concat these to return those to, return those to the comment on issues function. And we set a slug function here just because it's easier to say, yeah, the agent's email, but the first part before the @ sign. It gets tedious to write it over and over and over again. So the actual ticket review function that we saw above is basically going to say, well, if the agent has a comments file, basically what we're going to do is we're going to make sure we can read it, and we're going to return an empty array unless they've set ticket review to true. Now, if it can't read the file, it's going to tell us I can't use the file, I'm using the default file, and that'll just grab random tickets for the agent. And the way that works is it's going to take all the public comments from the main Zendesk instance, run unique on them, map them, and it's going to basically map them to this string right here. It's going to do the same for the US Fed instance. It's going to concat these into one giant array and then run sample3, which will give us 3 random from this list. Now the from comment file is going to look for the comments file. It's kind of the same deal of can I load it? Return like any comments they have, which might be an empty array, could be comments. If it can't read the file, it says I'm going to use default. It'll go to default, the default comments file, and it'll return those. Announcement files, the exact same deal basically. Can I read the announcement file? If I can, do they return their comments? If I can't, then we're just going to have an empty thing because we don't have any announcements by default. The agenda file, we saw that in the clients function where it basically is going to grab the agenda file and give us the content. If it has comments, cool, return them. But otherwise, it's just going to basically, give us an empty array. You see the empty file function here. All that literally is doing is, once again, calling to it, making sure that it's not empty. And then the empty file ops, we have, I'm sorry, I'm misreading my own stuff. The empty file function is actually going to make a post request to their repo to empty out their agenda file. And that's because it's supposed to empty after the report is made. And the empty file ops, we have the branch master, the commit message is reset agenda, and the actions are, it's going to update it. It's going to update the agenda.md, and the content it's updating with is blank. Beyond that, we have the create issue function. You saw that called earlier. All that's doing is creating an issue. Not very original naming. And we have the create comment, which is taking the IID and creating a comment on the issue we've already created. That's all there really is to the actual weekly issue. We'll go over the monthly issue real quick, but you're going to see it's very similar. We've got the request, data, run is going to check if it's a valid agent. You call the data function, generate an issue. Analyze reports. In this case, we're having to combine Zendesk and GitLab, whereas before we just had to combine Zendesk. But you'll find it's not very different. The fetch reports, instead of it being 7 days ago, right, we want a month ago because this is a monthly report. And the quarterly report will basically say a quarter ago, but I don't know if that's an actual Ruby function, so we've defined what a quarter ago means. Here we set the title, check if agent is valid. It's basically going to take the environment, that agent name that was required to run this, and confirm that it can find them in the file, in the users. If it can't, it's going to say, yeah, I don't have a user. It's going to raise an error in the function. Otherwise, it'll return true. The combining Zendesk reports, it's going to look almost identical to what we just saw. Combining GitLab reports is pretty much the same thing. It's just squashing all these together. And that's really all there is. It's concatenating them together essentially. And then we generate the issue. And yeah, that's all there really is to this. The quarterly one is going to be the exact same kind of deal. So beyond that, beyond the GitLab files, there's the PagerDuty files. Once again, like we're setting the client to the PagerDuty client request. We're setting that. The current date, start date, the current end date, next start date, next end date. These are all just date functions to give us the date range. The current options or the next option. So the current on call, the next on call. We're going to go through these schedules using the static data on call information. And yeah, we're just going to determine who's scheduled. So this is going to go through them and determine who's actually scheduled for what date, and add that to their PagerDuty object, and then return this back. That's all this is really doing. So it's a relatively simple file. The other one to look at would be Zendesk, which is just calling to Zendesk itself. It's calling these Zendesk files within here. We'll go over global because US Federal is very, very, very similar with the exception of the URL basically. So we set the URL to the GitLab, the gitlab.zendesk.com/agent. We set the title to gathering Zendesk global tickets. We just output that. Client is the Zendesk client. The data is parsing the tickets. We'll go over that in a bit. The artifact file, Zendesk global only, it outputs that to data JSON. It's good to have this artifact handy. Agents we're calling from the users. An agent Zendesk object is going to be agent Zendesk main. It's quicker to just make a function for this than to actually write it out every time. Beyond that, we've got the start time and the end time. Start time is going to be the previous day, UTC at midnight, basically today, and then today's midnight is the end time. From there, we're going to parse tickets. So what we're going to do is do a Zendesk API collection. And what it is we want to pass it to the client. We're going to say we want a Zendesk API ticket object. That's the objects we're working with. We want to sort by the updated date, sort it by descending. And we want to include organizations and users. This is so we have all the information we need for the tickets. And from there, skip the iteration if the updated ad is after the end time, skip it if it's before the start time, print a dot to show that we're reading it, and then run the analyze ticket function. When it's done, it'll say done, and it'll return the entire agent's object. Now, analyze tickets, it's essentially going to handle assignee, CCs, SAT, and parsing the comments. Handle assignee is pretty simple. If the assignee is blank, skip the ticket. If otherwise, we want to use the agents that we have to determine who the assignee is. If we can't figure that out, skip the ticket. Otherwise, add it to their assignee object, assignee, hash, array, I should say. SAT assignee is kind of the same deal. It's basically if we can determine the assignee, put it in their SAT because it has SAT. And that'll come down when we get to the handle SAT function. Handle CCs, basically it's going to look for the follower IDs on the ticket and find the agent itself and add it to their CCs. That's all it's going to do. If it can't figure out who an agent is, it's going to skip them. Handle SAT, it's going to return if the SAT score is unoffered or if it is offered, because we want it to be good or bad. We need actual SAT, not just we've not offered, we have offered. And that's where we get to the SAT assignee function that was up here. Parse comments is going to be pretty much the exact same. It's going to go through the comments. It's going to include the users. And if it was created after the end time or before the start time, it's going to skip it. Otherwise, it'll analyze the comment. Analyze comment is going to figure out the author, and that's going to use it by detecting from the object. If it's empty, we're not going to proceed. If the comment's public, push it to that person's public comments. If it's private, put it to their private comments. We use if else here because if it's not public, it is private. We have a ticket object here because you'll see a lot of these say push ticket object. The reason for that is we want all of this information here. And then for organization, It's a ticket organization ID or organization.name, but that became a lot to type since some tickets don't have organizations. Beyond that, we can look at the US federal real quick, but you'll see this one I did a little smarter because I told it to inherit from global, so we didn't have to define as much. So in this case, I need to change the URL, the agent Zendesk, the title, and the artifact, and the object, but that's it. We don't actually have to change anything else because everything else was defined in the other one. Now, real quick, I'll go over this real quick. We have the schedules, generate one-on-one issues daily. This is where it's going to check to see if it should make one-on-one issues. It gathers the metrics daily. It creates at 3. It gathers at 1. Thanks to runtimes, we know that that's plenty of gap. It's actually probably more than enough. So that's all there really is to the one-on-one issue generator. By all means, feel free to go through a lot of the other stuff like the gem file and the .rubu cop to see kind of the things I said to ignore because I don't want to actually check for those when I do my own syntax checking. Feel free to read the repo file, kind of learn through it. You can even make your own, you can even put your own one-on-one issue generator stuff in the support team YAML file so you can have them generated for yourself and kind of see what you're looking at. Up to you, but by all means, if you need any assistance, feel free to reach out to your fellow support ops team members or myself. We're always happy to help. I hope you found this educational, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.